Welcome back. We're discussing the growth of Ethiopia. Since 2013, more than 1 million Ethiopians have essentially pulled themselves out of poverty. Still with us from London is Elsje Fourie, Assistant Professor of Globalization and Development from Dubai.Zemedeneh Negatu, the Managing Director for Ernst and Young, and from Los Angeles, Ted Alemayhu, Founder and Executive Chairman of US Doctors for Africa. Zem, I want to get back to something you said earlier on when we were looking at the factors that are driving growth in Ethiopia. You mentioned investment. We know that investment is a finite commodity. Countries all over the world are competing for investment. How have you created the climate in Ethiopia that makes it an attractive place for businesses to come there and see this as a good deal?
It's a very good question. And again, let me use some numbers. As recently as 2008, foreign direct investment was about $100 million in Ethiopia. This past year, this year that just closed, it was $1.5 billion. That means it has increased by a factor of 15. So coming back to your question, why is that? I mean, there's a number of regions, and I think China also plays a very important role since we're now on CCTV. Investors, including the Chinese, are now looking for the next so-called China, although no one can be the size of China, but everybody's looking for the next China. And they've identified Ethiopia as one of those countries to replace China, certainly in large-scale, labor-intensive manufacturing. So this year we did, in our firm at Ernst and Young, we've released our Africa Attractiveness Survey. It's a global survey. And one of the interesting discoveries we have is that last year Ethiopia was amongst the top 10 FDI destinations in Africa. But what's more astonishing was that almost 1 out of 5 FDI jobs created in Africa last year was accounted for by one country, which is Ethiopia. That's because a lot of the FDI that is coming into Ethiopia, as I said, is labor-intensive, large-scale manufacturing. A very, very good example in this regard is the world's largest manufacturer of women's shoes. It is a Chinese company called Huajian, which 3.5 years ago opened a factory in Ethiopia in the Eastern Industrial Zone, which is just 35 miles from Addis. When they started out, they had about 700 employees. Now they have close to 4,000, but I just recently met the founder and the chairman. He was in Addis, and he just inaugurated an industrial park that will employ 50,000 Ethiopians. And the beautiful part of this is that almost all, in fact, all the shoes that are manufactured in Ethiopia by this Chinese company is now going to the United States. So next time you go through the stores in the States, you flip over where it says it's made in China, it's made in Ethiopia by a Chinese company. Tommy Hilfiger is a very good example. Natural. So these are the kinds of things. So why are investors coming? As I said, affordable labor. I think labor in Ethiopia is about 1/10 of 20% of Chinese wages. Electricity, it's the cheapest on earth at 4 cents per kilowatt hour on earth. I mean, so when you go into manufacturing, you need electricity. When you go into large-scale manufacturing, you need affordable labor. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the first part, large scale of infrastructure, the railway that is being built by the Chinese all the way from Ethiopia to the port of Djibouti. So all these elements are starting to come together, and investors are starting to say, this is a place we want to be.
Right, Elsje, we talked a moment ago about economic models being emulated by countries in Africa. And as you pointed out, this is not a one-size-fits-all scenario. You wrote a piece in The Guardian in which you said that the idea that countries might want to learn from each other's broad development experiences strikes a lot of people as being problematic or odd. And as you pointed out in that piece, you said that donors prefer locality-specific solutions. So how is this working in Africa?
Well, so I think there's an interesting tension there, because I think a large part of what we've realized in the last 10 or 20 years about development is that often solutions do have to be bottom-up and small-scale and take cognizance of local realities. And I think actually that mainstream donors have actually taken that on board to a certain extent. So it is interesting now to speak on the other side of this potential to still bring these large, one could say top-down models to a country like Ethiopia. And there's an interesting tension there, I think, and neither side, let's say, I think can really offer the full solution. there's a need to indigenize things and also to listen to how local people might have been doing things for a very long time. But there's also, of course, the chance to improve and to take certain lessons from other countries. But I think also one thing that people also sometimes overplay the selectivity with which a model is applied. When Ethiopia's emulation of China or South Korea is spoken about, for example, often there is the narrative that only economic lessons have been taken, and that this is a very technocratic, apolitical sort of decision. And I think what we do have to realize is that there's also political decisions that do get, and political lessons that do get transferred. Things such as a sort of, it has to be said, a centralized rolling out of these processes, and a narrative of growth which is powerful, but which also doesn't allow for a lot of dissent. So I think this is kind of one of the sides that often isn't so comfortable when we speak about the emulation of models, is the idea that also the historical legacy, let's say, that Ethiopia has of a centralized political system makes it easy to learn from countries that have had the kind of classical developmental state model that hasn't had a kind of liberal consultative democracy to guide this process. And I think we do see in Ethiopia that this process is achieving a lot, but is also bringing about certain political tensions, and there is a feeling, I think, among parts of the population that the consultation process is lacking.
Zem, how did a country like Ethiopia overcome ethnic and political rivalries? The Prime Minister Meles Zenawi pointed out at one point that in 1991 there was something like 17 different ethnic and political groups that were fighting in the country, but Ethiopia seems to have risen above that. How did that happen?
Well, again, listen, if we look at the development path many other countries that have been very successful in Asia took, it has to be inclusive because, as you've noted, it's a very, first of all, a huge country of 94, 95 million people. Most populous, second most populous country in Africa after Nigeria. Very diverse ethnicity. But also remember where they started from. In 91, it was a completely bankrupt country. So tensions could continue or rise if it wasn't inclusive. But if you start, as I said earlier, a bottoms-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach, which in some other African countries we've seen has been a big challenge, then the tensions that you mentioned, which could surface because of all kinds of reasons, will be diminished. I just want to highlight one thing here as well, which goes to your point. If you look at the Gini coefficient, which is the most widely used measurement of income equality, Ethiopia has one of the best Gini coefficients in the world. And that's, I think, the kind of focus that they have given, and I would expect them to continue going forward because, as you said, it's a very diverse country. By the way, in a neighborhood that is very unstable. I mean, Ethiopia has neighbors, if you look at to the west, you have Sudan and South Sudan. South Sudan at the moment is in the middle of a civil war. Of course, we all know the story of Somalia. So, it is very critical for Ethiopia to maintain the kinds of inclusive growth as measured by some of these numbers going forward so that all these diverse groups in the country, which in our forecast and others, by 2025, there'll be 120 million Ethiopians. So this is my suggestion. And that's why I think, linking it to my earlier point, the large volumes of FDI have to come in, the private sector has to continue to grow so that wealth is created massively. Get this. Ethiopia adds 2.3 million people net every year to its population. That means rapid economic transformation and growth is the only solution for Ethiopia going forward. And that's why the growth has been very remarkable. Even the World Bank and others have been applauding Ethiopia.
Right. Elsje, I got a political question here, and it goes to some of the points that Zem just raised, and that is, what role does leadership play in these countries in Africa? Because if we look at developing countries, many of them in Africa, I mean, they've been cursed by bad governance, by endemic corruption. That's, of course, not unique to Africa. We see that all over the world. We see it right here in the United States. So how important is good government, good leadership?
Yes, I mean, I do think it's one of the factors that people rightly feel distinguishes Ethiopia from, let's say the problems that have beset some African regimes, because there is a sort of the idea that rents or gains in productivity seem to be invested for kind of long-term improvements rather than merely squirreled away into private bank accounts, as kind of unfortunately a stereotype is often run in other parts of the continent. So leadership has been important. Of course, the late Meles Zenawi was a very charismatic leader, very admired by large parts of the population. But I think also, again, it is this double-sided political issue that the leadership is let's say, focused on the long term and is not kleptocratic and is to a large extent developmental, but also is very strong and can sometimes be, strong to the extent that civil society, for example, doesn't feel it has a role to play. In the classic developmental state model, leadership is strong. Leadership parties tend to stay in power for a long time, and so it is a definite, let's say, political improvement on what has happened in Ethiopia in the past, and also it happens in other parts of the continent. But I would not say that there are no political problems, or that the leadership is necessarily, that we've reached some sort of benign, perfectly sort of, let's say, benevolent leadership. I don't think that. I think there's a large amount of debate, I think, that could still happen about improvements that could be made to the leadership. And just to respond to a previous point made by the previous speaker, I think we both agree very much that inequality, it's very important. It's the key to Ethiopia's development, is to avoid this inequality that at the moment hasn't, let's say, historically existed in Ethiopia. And while it is true that the Gini coefficient is low at the moment, I wouldn't be surprised if it is rising, and if it is going to rise in the future, because it is also one of the countries, as was mentioned earlier, that has one of the highest, the fastest growing, rates of dollar millionaires, Ethiopia. So I think it's very important. I think the leadership realizes that, but they need to really continue to realize that strong leadership that focuses on keeping inequality low is very important, because poverty reduction is one thing that makes people happy and contributes to people's quality of life. But inequality is a separate thing, and it's also very important.
Right. And Ted, when we talk about top-down, bottom-up kind of development, and we look at countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, you've got to have grassroots support, don't you, to make these plans work? People right down there have to support you.
Absolutely, and then obviously you can see that in Ethiopia. When I started my conversation, and I mentioned that Ethiopians within Ethiopia and Ethiopians abroad are quite excited and motivated and fired up at what's happening in the country, and that contribution is obviously supporting the government's initiative, whether from the economic development to improvement of many other sectors they're undertaking. And the challenge, obviously, every government has a challenge, every country has a challenge. We have a challenge right here in the United States. So I think encouraging and pushing and supporting such an exciting initiative and Africa is important. As Zemedeneh pointed out, you got a market over 94 million people, an exploding economy, cheap labor, and what have you. So Ethiopia is just a perfect example of what's happening over there.
Right. Zem, when we look at almost every future scenario for the developing world, Africa in particular, education is always emphasized as something that should be focused on above everything else, basic education skills. To what extent is that a priority in Ethiopia?
Actually, it's a priority for the government to invest in the education sector. If you look at their annual budget, they allocate a very substantial portion. Again, here, numbers will tell a good story. About 15, 16 years ago, in Ethiopia, there were only 2 state-owned universities. Today, there are 32, and they have plans to increase that to 40 in the next 5 years. So education, they realize, not only is the number that is increasing in terms of institutions, but what they have done a few years ago, they changed the curriculum, because if Ethiopia's goal is to become a manufacturing hub like China and South Korea. In order for that to happen, they realized, and they have adapted what I think is a pretty smart policy, which is 75% of the graduating class has to be in science and technology and engineering, the kinds of things that are needed for manufacturing and economic transformation. So universal access to primary education is, I think, more than 90%. We've seen some data. So education is absolutely the foundation for Ethiopia's transformation, especially, as I said, it intends to become a middle-income country by 2025. That can only be achieved on the back of agricultural transformation, not just basic agriculture, but agro-industry and the adding up the value chain. For example, today, Ethiopia is the largest exporter of coffee in Africa, but what are they exporting? Commodity. And the plan going forward is to value add, the same thing of a lot of, so that requires high-powered education. All the infrastructure that is being built, I mentioned earlier about the huge hydropower dam, after it's built, it needs a lot of talented people to run it efficiently. The private sector needs a lot of talent to become efficient, competitive, and global. By the way, Ethiopia is starting to think cross-border going forward, and we have a very good example in that regard, Ethiopian Airlines, which is now the largest airline in Africa, which last year made more money than all African airlines combined. That's because it has a lot of talented people, from the pilots to the technicians. A lot of aircrafts are now from around Africa and other parts of the world are now being maintained in Ethiopia. That requires, so this goes back to your point about the importance of education. The government, the leadership realized this a long time ago, and they've started investing. By the way, they've also allowed private colleges and universities, and today there are more than 40 of them. Altogether, there's about more than 500,000 people today in colleges and universities in Ethiopia, in recognition of the fact that education is the key.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues. You can always chat with us on Twitter at @CCTV_America, or send us your comments to theheat@cctv-america.com. I'm Ernst Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.